Julie Gordon stood at the entrance of the Galactic Military Academy, her breath catching in her throat as she stared up at the gleaming spires that pierced the violet-hued sky. This was not just a school, it was the pinnacle of intergalactic military education, a place where the best and brightest from every corner of the galaxy came to prove themselves. The academy sprawled across an entire moon, its architecture a stunning blend of alien styles, with glowing pathways, levitating structures, and towering statues of legendary warriors from dozens of species. To Julie, it felt like stepping into a realm of gods. She adjusted the straps of her bag and took her first step forward, ignoring the knot twisting in her stomach. Everywhere she looked, alien cadets were gathered in groups, their vibrant uniforms a kaleidoscope of colors. Some had smooth, translucent skin that shimmered in the light. Others bristled with fur, scales, or metallic plating. A few were so alien in form that Julie couldn't determine where their eyes or limbs began and ended. Each of them exuded confidence, moving with the fluid grace of beings who had been trained in combat since birth. By contrast, Julie felt painfully ordinary, her plain human features drawing curious, and sometimes disdainful, glances. "Is that a human?" A voice hissed behind her. Julie didn't need to turn around to know they were talking about her. The whispers followed her as she walked through the main courtyard. "I thought humans were just primitive," another voice added, followed by a low chuckle. Julie gritted her teeth and kept walking. She had expected this. Humans were the newcomers to the galactic stage, their technology barely scratching the surface of what most other species considered basic. Earth had only been admitted to the Intergalactic Coalition a decade ago, and even then, it was more out of pity than respect. To the other cadets, her presence here must have seemed like a joke. The grand hall of the academy was bustling with activity. Holographic screens floated in midair, displaying schedules, maps, and announcements in dozens of languages. Julie scanned the crowd, trying to get her bearings. She spotted a towering alien with 6 muscular arms gesturing to a group of wide-eyed cadets, each of whom seemed to hang on his every word. Another group was gathered around a levitating sphere that displayed a holographic simulation of a battle, their arguments heated as they debated tactics. "Lost, human." The voice was sharp and mocking. Julie turned to see a tall, sleek alien with silver skin and eyes that glowed faintly blue. He was flanked by 2 others, their postures radiating arrogance. "No," Julie replied curtly, refusing to let her voice waver. The alien smirked, tilting his head as he studied her. "You must be Julie Gordon, the token human. I'm sure you'll make a fascinating study in failure." Julie clenched her fists but didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with bullies only gave them what they wanted. Instead, she squared her shoulders and walked past them, ignoring the laughter that followed her. She wouldn't let them get to her. She was here for a reason, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. Her quarters were small but functional, a stark contrast to the opulent designs she had seen elsewhere in the academy. The walls were bare, the bed a simple platform, and the only decoration was a holographic panel that displayed the view of a nearby nebula. Julie unpacked her belongings quickly, her movements brisk and purposeful. She couldn't afford to dwell on how out of place she felt. The orientation was in an hour, and she needed to be ready. The orientation hall was vast, its domed ceiling painted with a swirling depiction of galaxies and star systems. Hundreds of cadets filled the room, their chatter creating a low hum that echoed off the walls. Julie found a seat near the back, hoping to avoid drawing attention to herself. The academy's head instructor, a towering alien with a serpentine body and scales that shimmered like liquid metal, slithered onto the stage. The room fell silent as his voice boomed through the hall, commanding attention. "Welcome, cadets, to the Galactic Military Academy," he began. "You are here because you represent the best of your species. Each of you has proven yourself to be exceptional in your own right. But here, you are equals. Here, you will be tested in ways you cannot yet imagine. Some of you will rise to greatness. Others will falter. The path ahead will not be easy. Julie felt a shiver run down her spine. The weight of the instructor's words pressed heavily on her. She wasn't sure if they were meant to inspire or intimidate, but they had succeeded in doing both. For the final assessment at the end of this program, you will participate in a battle simulation that will test your strategic abilities, adaptability, and teamwork, the instructor continued. Only the top-ranking cadets will earn the title of Galactic Commander. The rest will fail. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Julie's heart sank. She had known the competition would be fierce, but hearing it laid out so starkly made it feel all the more daunting. She glanced around the room, taking in the confident faces of her peers. They were all so sure of themselves, so certain of their superiority. As the orientation ended and the cadets began to file out, Julie lingered for a moment, letting the crowd thin out. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a battlefield, even if the real battles were still weeks away. Back in her quarters, Julie sat at her desk, staring at the holographic screen in front of her. She pulled up the profiles of the other cadets, studying their strengths and achievements. Most of them had years of experience in combat or strategy, some even boasting accolades from intergalactic tournaments. Julie had none of that. All she had was her determination and a sharp mind that had carried her through countless challenges back on Earth. She began devising a plan. If she was going to survive here, she needed to understand her opponents better than they understood themselves. She spent hours poring over data, analyzing patterns in their tactics, and studying the Academy's archives for any insights she could find. It was exhausting, but she couldn't afford to rest. She was the underdog, and she knew it. But she also knew that being underestimated could be her greatest weapon. As the days passed, Julie kept a low profile, focusing on her training and avoiding unnecessary interactions. The other cadets continued to mock and dismiss her, but she didn't let it show. She absorbed every lesson, every piece of information, and every mistake, slowly building a foundation of knowledge that she hoped would be enough. Unbeknownst to her peers, the human cadet was preparing for the fight of her life. And while they laughed and boasted, Julie was quietly, methodically, setting the stage for a battle that would leave them all stunned. The exam had been the talk of the Academy for weeks, its impending arrival a constant undercurrent in every conversation. The hallways buzzed with speculation and strategies as cadets prepared for the battle simulation that would determine their ranks. Julie kept to herself, methodically studying the details provided about the simulation. Each cadet would be assigned a zone in a massive virtual battlefield, equipped with limited resources, and tasked with conquering territories while defending their own. Success relied not only on military prowess but also on adaptability, resource management, and strategic thinking. The day of the exam arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The cadets gathered in the main simulation chamber, a cavernous room filled with rows of simulation pods. Each pod was designed to immerse its occupant fully in the virtual environment, translating their commands and movements into actions within the simulation. Julie stood at the edge of the group, watching as the other cadets bantered and postured. Some of them cast mocking glances her way, but she ignored them. This was her chance to prove herself, and she wouldn't let their derision shake her focus. "Cadets, take your positions," the instructor's voice boomed over the speakers. The room fell silent as the cadets filed into their assigned pods. Julie's pod was at the far end of the room, its sleek, metallic surface reflecting her determined expression. She took a deep breath, stepping inside and strapping herself into the seat. The pod's interface flickered to life, and a calm, mechanical voice began explaining the rules of the simulation. You will have 10 minutes to assess your initial zone and resources before the simulation begins. From that point, you are free to expand, defend, or form alliances. Your performance will be judged on multiple criteria, including territorial control, resource efficiency, and strategic innovation. Good luck. Baka. The countdown began, and the pod's interior shifted as the simulation loaded. Julie's surroundings transformed into a vast, rugged landscape dotted with hills, rivers, and dense forests. Her initial zone was small, a barren patch of land with a single outpost and a handful of troops. A holographic map appeared before her, displaying the entire battlefield and the starting positions of her opponents. Each cadet's zone was marked with a glowing beacon, their names and species displayed beside them. The map was vast, with dozens of zones stretching across varied terrains, from desert plains to icy tundras. Julie's fingers hovered over the controls as she analyzed her situation. Her starting resources were minimal: a small force of basic infantry, a handful of defensive structures, and a meager supply of energy. By contrast, some of the other cadets had been assigned zones rich in resources or strategically advantageous terrain. It was clear that the simulation wasn't designed to be fair. Each cadet would face unique challenges, tailored to test their specific skills or, in Julie's case, to highlight her perceived weaknesses. The timer hit 0, and the simulation began. Julie wasted no time. She directed her troops to scout the surrounding area, gathering intelligence on nearby resources and potential threats. Her initial surveys revealed a dense forest to the north, which could serve as a natural barrier against enemy advances, and a river to the east, providing a valuable defensive line. To the south, however, lay an open plain that left her zone vulnerable to attack. She would need to secure that flank quickly. As her troops moved out, Julie focused on optimizing her resources. She allocated her energy supply carefully, constructing additional defensive structures and deploying automated scouts to gather more data. While other cadets might have rushed to expand their territories, Julie knew that reckless expansion could leave her exposed. She prioritized stability and preparation, building a solid foundation before making her next move. The first signs of conflict appeared on the map as neighboring cadets began skirmishing over contested zones. Julie monitored their movements closely, noting patterns in their strategies. One cadet, a towering reptilian creature named Dravok, was aggressively expanding his territory, steamrolling weaker opponents with sheer brute force. Another, a sleek, insectoid cadet named Vrixa, relied on stealth and subterfuge, using her species' cloaking abilities to ambush her enemies. Julie filed these observations away, knowing they would be crucial later. As the hours passed, Julie's patience and meticulous planning began to pay off. While other cadets exhausted their resources in rapid expansions or prolonged battles, she had steadily built up her defenses and gathered a stockpile of energy and supplies. Her zone, though small, was a fortress, with strategically placed turrets and camouflaged bunkers hidden within the forest. She had also established a network of surveillance drones, giving her a clear view of the battlefield and allowing her to anticipate her opponent's moves. The first direct challenge came from a neighboring cadet, a hulking mammalian creature named Threx, whose zone bordered Julie's to the south. Threx had been one of the loudest voices mocking her before the exam, and it seemed he was eager to prove his superiority. His troops advanced across the plain, a massive force of heavily armored units supported by aerial drones. Julie's scouts had detected his movements early, giving her time to prepare. Instead of meeting Threx's forces head-on, Julie used the terrain to her advantage. She lured his troops into the open plain, where they were exposed to a barrage of artillery fire from her hidden turrets. At the same time, she deployed a small strike team to flank his position, targeting his supply lines and cutting off his reinforcements. The battle was intense, but Threx's overconfidence proved to be his downfall. By the end of the engagement, his forces were in disarray, and Julie had secured the southern flank. Word of Julie's victory spread quickly. The other cadets, who had dismissed her as an easy target, began to take notice. For the first time, she felt the weight of their scrutiny. Some saw her as a potential ally, while others viewed her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Julie knew that her success had painted a target on her back, but she welcomed the challenge. She was no longer the underdog who could be ignored. She was a contender. As the simulation progressed, Alliances began to form among the cadets. Some were strategic partnerships based on mutual interests, while others were fragile truces born out of desperation. Julie remained cautious, wary of aligning herself too closely with anyone. She had learned from observing the others that alliances could be as much a liability as an asset. Instead, she focused on maintaining her independence, using her growing reputation to keep potential aggressors at bay. By the end of the second phase of the exam, Julie had expanded her territory significantly, securing key resources and fortifying her defenses. She had outmaneuvered stronger opponents and turned her weaknesses into strengths, proving that her place in the academy was no accident. But she knew the real challenges were still to come. The cadets who remained were the best of the best, and the final phase of the exam would push them all to their limits. As the battlefield grew more chaotic, Julie prepared herself for the storm that was sure to come. She wasn't just fighting to prove herself anymore. She was fighting to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of, and she was determined to win. The simulation had reached its critical stage. The battlefield was now a patchwork of contested territories, with each cadet fiercely guarding their zones while eyeing the remaining resources scattered across the map. Julie sat in her pod, her hands steady on the controls as her mind raced to process the constant stream of data. The map before her was a kaleidoscope of movement, troops advancing, borders shifting, alliances breaking. She could feel the tension in the air, even through the virtual interface. This was the phase where the true leaders would emerge, and she was determined to be one of them. Her early victories had not gone unnoticed. The cadets who had once dismissed her as a non-threat now watched her movements closely, and some had even begun to coordinate against her. She could sense it in the subtle shifts of their tactics, the way they avoided direct conflict with her forces while probing the edges of her territory. Julie had expected this. She knew that being underestimated had been her greatest advantage, and now that it was gone, she needed to rely on something else: her ability to think several steps ahead. Her territory had expanded considerably since the start of the simulation. From the modest outpost she had been assigned, she now controlled a sprawling zone that included dense forests, a river that served as a natural barrier, and several resource-rich areas that had become the backbone of her strategy. Her defenses were formidable, a mix of automated turrets, camouflaged bunkers, and traps carefully hidden within the terrain. But she knew that defense alone wouldn't be enough. To win, she needed to take the fight to her opponents. The first target was Dravok, the reptilian cadet who had dominated the early stages of the simulation with brute force. His strategy had been straightforward: overwhelm his opponents with sheer numbers and power. But his relentless expansion had left his supply lines stretched thin, and Julie had been watching for an opportunity to exploit this weakness. Now, as his forces moved to attack a neighboring cadet, she saw her chance. Julie dispatched a small, fast-moving strike team to cut off Dravok's supply lines. Using the dense forest as cover, her troops infiltrated his territory, targeting his resource hubs and communication relays. The attacks were swift and precise, leaving his forces scrambling to respond. At the same time, she launched a diversionary assault on one of his outposts, drawing his attention away from the real threat. By the time Dravok realized what was happening, it was too late. His supply lines were in chaos, and his forces were weakened and disorganized. Julie's victory over him was not just a triumph of strategy, but a statement to the other cadets she was a force to be reckoned with. But the victory came at a cost. The coordinated attacks on her territory began almost immediately. Vrixa, the insectoid cadet known for her stealth tactics, struck first, sending cloaked units to sabotage her defenses. Julie had anticipated this, and had stationed scouts equipped with advanced detection equipment along her borders. The ambushes were repelled, but they were only the beginning. Other cadets, emboldened by the hope of taking her down, began testing her defenses with probing attacks. It was clear they saw her as the biggest threat remaining in the simulation. Julie found herself fighting on multiple fronts. Her resources stretched thin as she tried to hold her territory while continuing to advance. She relied on her network of drones and scouts to monitor the battlefield, using the intelligence they gathered to stay one step ahead of her enemies. She prioritized her movements carefully, choosing her battles with precision and avoiding unnecessary risks. Every decision was a gamble, every move a test of her ability to adapt and think under pressure. The turning point came during an encounter with Threx, the mammalian cadet she had defeated earlier in the simulation. Humiliated by his earlier loss, Threx had spent the intervening time rebuilding his forces and forming alliances with other cadets. Now, he launched a full-scale assault on Julie's territory, backed by 2 other cadets who had joined his cause. It was an overwhelming force, and for the first time, Julie felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. Could she hold them off? Her first move was to evacuate non-essential personnel and resources from the threatened zones, consolidating her forces in key defensive positions. She then used her knowledge of the terrain to set traps and ambushes along the enemy's advance. As Threx's forces moved through the forest, they were met with a barrage of artillery fire and hidden mines that slowed their progress and sowed confusion. At the same time, Julie launched hit and run attacks on their rear lines, targeting their supply convoys and forcing them to divert resources to defend themselves. The battle was fierce and grueling, with losses on both sides, but Julie's careful planning and adaptability began to turn the tide. Threx's forces, stretched thin and unable to coordinate effectively, started to falter. When Julie saw the opportunity, she launched a decisive counterattack, driving them back and reclaiming the territory they had taken. Threx and his allies were forced to retreat, their alliance fractured by the defeat. The final phase of the simulation was a chaotic free-for-all. Only a handful of cadets remained, each controlling significant portions of the battlefield. Alliances were non-existent now, it was every cadet for themselves. Julie focused on maintaining her momentum, using the lessons she had learned throughout the simulation to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics of the battlefield. She continued to exploit her opponent's weaknesses, striking where they were most vulnerable and avoiding direct confrontations unless she had a clear advantage. As the timer for the simulation's conclusion ticked down, Julie found herself in a final standoff with Vrixa, whose stealth tactics had allowed her to survive despite the odds. The 2 cadets had been circling each other for hours, probing for weaknesses and trying to outmaneuver one another. Julie knew that Vrixa's cloaking abilities gave her an edge in direct combat, but she also knew that the battlefield's terrain could be her ally. In a bold move, Julie used her remaining resources to set a trap, luring Vrixa's forces into a narrow canyon where their mobility would be limited. She positioned her troops strategically, using the terrain to create choke points and ambushes. When Vrixa's forces entered the canyon, they were met with a devastating barrage of firepower. The battle was intense, but Julie's careful planning and strategic positioning gave her the upper hand. Vrixa's forces were defeated, and the simulation ended with Julie as the top-ranking cadet. As she emerged from the simulation pod, her body aching from hours of tension, Julie was met with silence. The other cadets who had mocked and underestimated her now looked at her with a mix of awe and respect. The instructor's voice echoed through the chamber, announcing her victory and commending her for her ingenuity and resilience. Julie allowed herself a small smile. She had proven herself, not just to the other cadets but to herself. She had shown that humanity, despite its limitations, had the potential to stand among the galaxy's greatest. And this was just the beginning. The final moments of the simulation still echoed in Julie's mind as she walked out of the simulation chamber. The cheers of victory she had hoped for were replaced by a stunned, almost reverent silence. The room was filled with cadets from across the galaxy, many of whom had dismissed her as nothing more than an outlier, a primitive human who had no business being in their ranks. Now, those same cadets couldn't seem to meet her gaze. Julie tried to keep her expression neutral, but her heart was pounding. She had done it. Against all odds, she had not only survived the simulation but emerged victorious. Her territory, strategy, and adaptability had outclassed every opponent. And yet, this was more than just a win. It was a declaration. Humanity, long considered a fringe species with little to offer the galaxy, had just taken its first step onto the intergalactic stage. She had become their representative, their proof of potential. The head instructor, a towering serpent-like being named Commander Jacques Var, slithered onto the central platform as the remaining cadets gathered. His scales shimmered with an iridescent glow that reflected the light of the Academy's high domed ceiling. When he spoke, his voice resonated throughout the chamber with the weight of authority. "Cadets," he began, his piercing eyes sweeping across the crowd, "you have all witnessed the conclusion of this year's battle simulation. A test designed not merely to assess your ability to wage war, but to measure your resourcefulness, creativity, and capacity for leadership. And today, one cadet has demonstrated these qualities in a manner that exceeded our expectations." The room remained silent as Jacques Var turned to Julie, his gaze settling on her with an intensity that made her want to straighten her posture. She felt every eye in the room follow his line of sight. "Julie Gordon, human cadet," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You have achieved what many believe to be impossible. You entered this academy as an outsider, underestimated and untested, yet you have proven yourself not only equal but superior to your peers. Step forward." Julie hesitated for a moment, her legs suddenly feeling heavier than they ever had. But she pushed herself forward, each step measured and deliberate as she approached the platform. As she stood before Jacques Var, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her. It was about Earth, about humanity's place in the galaxy. "Tell us," Jacques Var continued, his voice quieter now, as if addressing her alone. "What drove you to succeed against such overwhelming odds?" Julie took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Commander," she began, her voice steadied despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Humans are often seen as weak, primitive, even insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But what I've learned is that our greatest strength lies in our ability to adapt, to think differently, and to persevere no matter the challenge. I knew I couldn't rely on brute strength or advanced technology like some of my peers. So I relied on what I did have: creativity, resourcefulness, and determination." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and then, to her surprise, Jacques Var nodded. "An excellent answer, cadet. And a lesson I hope all of you will take to heart," he said, turning to address the rest of the room. "Victory does not always belong to the strongest or the most well-equipped. It belongs to those who can see beyond the obvious, who can adapt and endure. Julie Gordon has shown us all what it means to be a true leader." The silence broke with a wave of applause. It wasn't unanimous. There were still some who resented her success, who viewed her victory as an anomaly rather than a testament to her skill, but it was enough. Julie felt a swell of pride as she stood there, accepting the recognition she had worked so hard to earn. Later that evening, as the cadets dispersed, Julie found herself walking through the Academy's central garden. The simulated sky above was filled with stars, and the air carried a faint, floral scent. It was a rare moment of peace in a place defined by constant competition and pressure. She stopped at a bench near a small fountain, letting the sound of trickling water soothe her nerves. Her thoughts drifted back to Earth, to the people who had believed in her, and to those who hadn't. She thought about the challenges she had faced, the ridicule she had endured, and the sacrifices she had made to get here. It had all been worth it. She had not only proven herself but had also opened a door for others like her. Gordon. The voice startled her, and she turned to see Vrixa standing nearby, her slender, insectoid form silhouetted against the glowing foliage. Her compound eyes glinted in the starlight, unreadable yet curious. "Vrixa," Julie said, nodding politely. She wasn't sure what to expect from the cadet she had defeated in the final moments of the simulation. "You fought well," Vrixa said, her voice carrying a faint clicking sound. "Better than I expected. Better than anyone expected." "Thanks," Julie replied cautiously. You were a tough opponent. Vrixa tilted her head, studying Julie. You changed the way I see your kind, she said finally. I won't underestimate humans again. With that, Vrixa turned and walked away, leaving Julie to process her words. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was something a grudging respect that hinted at the possibility of something more in the future. And for Julie, that was enough. The next morning, as the academy returned to its usual routines, Julie found herself standing in front of a large holographic screen in the main hall. It displayed the rankings from the simulation, with her name at the very top. Beneath it was a message from the instructor's congratulations to Cadet Julie Gordon, the first human to claim victory in the Galactic Military Academy's battle simulation. May this be the first of many milestones for her and her species. Julie stared at the message, a small smile tugging at her lips. She knew this was only the beginning. The challenges ahead would be even greater, the stakes higher. But she was ready. She had proven to herself and to the galaxy that humanity had a place among the stars. And now she was determined to make sure that place was earned and remembered. As she walked away, the whispers of her fellow cadets followed her, not of ridicule this time, but of respect, curiosity, and even admiration. Julie Gordon, the human cadet from Earth, had not only survived the academy but had left an indelible mark on it. The stars awaited, and she was ready to rise to the challenge.